I'm really glad that I sent out that good acronym. But I can't say you almost every. You gotta see the same. Other language. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, my first.
Are you still doing? What was the authority like?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know.
So it's.
About.
You know. That's good. People there. Yeah.
Yeah. What is the love?
The learning. I'll go.
It's great. You guys You ready?
Right.
Oh, yeah, I can't find you.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no one. It's all smart, probably. You're still. They're very dull.
Yeah, remember, I went to the sheet, I was like. Yeah.
See super happy.
I think it's not a real.
My mom.
What are they doing?
I haven't.
I'm very pleased to introduce our very. And Sally and I were just talking before this, usually you don't give a talk in your own
department unless you're going out for some kind of promotion or something like that, so you gotta feel some new promotion to give you if your
Yeah.
job's good.
Exactly. Well, then everybody else has to do it too.
But Sally did, she got a PhD at Brown University and after a brief stint up at Washington State University, going back faculty here in nuclear biology, where he's a full professor. And in addition to lots of publications and lots of students she mentors, she is also the co-author of several important books, a textbook, the defense of ecology, and also general introductory biology textbooks. She's the expert now. And I couldn't help but kind of peek at her CV before introducing her here, and I noticed the very first publication you ever did is on pineapple pots.
Yeah.
So this is good, we're gonna talk about plants today, I'm assuming, but maybe there's still hope. With that, Sally, take it away.
Great, thank you. And actually, all of my degrees are in invertebrate zoology, so. Yeah, there you go. All right. So, yeah, I had to chuckle because when Mark gave his talk, you know, he mentioned that it was the first time he'd given a departmental seminar since he had been promoted. And then I realized that this is the first time that I've given a departmental seminar since I was promoted, which was in 2010. So it was 15 years ago. And what I was doing 15 years ago was very different, obviously, than what I'm doing today. And I'm not going to present all of what I've done over the last 15 years, because that would be a very long seminar and very scattered. But I did want to kind of reminisce a little bit and go back to 2010, or in this case, 2011. And at that time, I was thinking a lot about ecosystem services, and I was part of a working group at NCEAS, so the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And I was part of this working group that was just really great for people to work with. Coastal scientists, applied economists, ecologists, biogeochemists, all kinds of folks that were part of this group. And a splinter group decided to write, and I was part of that splinter group, decided to write a review of coastal and estuarine ecosystem services. The value of estuarine and coastal ecosystem services was the title. This was in ecological monographs. And when I sort of was reminiscing over this, I realized that I kind of learned two lessons from writing this paper. One was that coastal ecosystems are created through biophysical feedbacks. So I'm going to talk today about biophysical feedbacks and how important those are. And also that they provide really unique ecosystem services because they're at this kind of land-sea interface. And also that they can dynamically mitigate coastal change. We care about that because mitigating what's happening on our coast is especially important, given that coasts have very, very high development pressures and also extreme storms and sea level rise. So we care about these habitats because they're kind of at this intersection of a lot of different things that are happening. And the second lesson is that coastal ecosystem services and the processes that control them are very understudied. So we know, not very much about them. I mean, that was 15 years ago. Definitely we've made progress in thinking about these systems, but they are very understudied. And I guess I would say the third lesson is if you write a paper for the first time that people can cite, this is the first paper that people are able to cite about a topic, you can get 7,000 citations, which is what this paper has over the last 15 years. So they're understudied systems, and particularly beaches and dunes. So I have a little asterisk down there. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, or dune ecosystems. And I've worked in two different systems, Pacific Northwest Coast systems, which I'm gonna mostly talk about today. Those are in Oregon and Washington and somewhat in Northern California. And then Central Atlantic Coast systems, so I've done work out on the other coast, on the North Carolina Outer Bank system. Really, really different in systems from a variety of perspectives. So to do this work, you need a team of people. And so my team consists of Peter Ruggiero, who is a professor here at NCOs. Peter and I have collaborated for many, many years, probably since I came here 20 years ago. And then Megan Wengrove, who is a newer professor. She's in civil engineering. She's a coastal engineer. And then Laura Moore, who is a geomorphologist at UNC Chapel Hill. And all the work that I've done out in North Carolina has involved Laura. And we've been funded by a variety of agencies, NSF, EPA, NOAA, US, the Army Corps of Engineers, Sea Grant, etc. So I have a lot of funding to do this work. And of course, without amazing grad students and dozens, maybe hundreds of undergrads, also this work would not exist. And so they're very, very important in the work I'm going to talk about today. And the work involves a lot of field work, which is really fun. And so I just wanted to show this photo, which actually shows some of the undergrads that were involved. So Pacific Northwest dunes make up nearly 50% of our coastline. So really common, extensive habitats. And actually the largest dune sheet in North America occurs here in Oregon. So it's down, between Florence and East Bay. And that really immense kind of sandy landscape has inspired many people, but including Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune in the late 1950s. And Dune was based on his experiences eating magic mushrooms and wandering around in these large, very large sandy dune sheets. So whenever I talk about dunes here in the Northwest, I like to focus on the past, then the present, and then obviously the future. So I kind of going to break my talk up into those sections. So what about the past? Well, the past was very different than it is today. Our local dunes were open, shifting sand environments. Prior to 1900, Pacific dunes were very sparsely vegetated systems, really dynamic, open, shifting sand environments. There were plants, so there was a native plant community that included a diversity of different species that kind of thrived under this kind of open, shifting sand environment. Many of these species, well, some of them are endemic to the Northwest and endemic to sand, definitely endemic to sand. But we know really little about the natural history of native dunes. We don't even really know what species are present, in what abundance, what these communities look like, which I think has, implications in terms of how to restore them. We also have a native dune grass. Species name is Lamus mollis, or we call it LAMO. You'll see why in a minute, but Lamus mollis is the American dune grass. There's a picture of it here. And it was native on dunes and is still present on our dunes today. So the shifting sand environment really caused havoc for European settlers who wanted to build towns and build roads and build railroads and so forth and settle the area. And sand was just too mobile for them to cope with. And so there's a lot of old newspaper clippings about, the scourge of the sand and wanting to be able to control this kind of environment. And so in the early 1900s, there was a really concerted effort to plant sand stabilizing beach grasses. These are non-native beach grasses. They were introduced widely, starting in San Francisco, actually. So in the, Northern California, and then moving up here into Oregon and up into Washington. And so these beach grasses were planted. Here's a picture. I love this picture of this guy in this beach garb out there planting beach grasses. And you can see at his feet, there are a bunch of little plugs of beach grasses that he was planting in front of his property. And the beach grasses did really well and actually stabilized this shifting sand environment and created what we call foredunes, which are these kind of linear hills of sand behind the beach. And not only was one species planted, but actually two different species of beach grasses were planted. In the early 1900s, the first one was the European beach grass, or Ammophila arenaria, was widely planted throughout the entire Pacific coast. By the 1950s, Ammophila arenaria, or AMAR, had colonized from Mexico all the way up into Canada. And now it's actually kind of right at the toe of Alaska, where there are dunes up there. And then in the 1930s, another species was planted. This is the American beach grass, and this American beach grass is actually from the East Coast, so from the Great Lakes and the East Coast of the Atlantic. And it was introduced in Northern Oregon, so actually right around the Columbia River and northward, and actually it colonized northward and outcompeted Ammophila arenaria, such that they do coexist together, but Ammophila breviligulata, which is the American beach grass, is actually a lot more, is basically the dominant grass species in these areas. And so here's a map actually made by Risa Askeruth that has data points or points on it where there were sightings of these different species of grasses. So you can see that Ammophila breviligulata is mostly in the north. There's a smattering of plants that people have discovered in various places, probably because of kind of random introductions that happened here and there. But for the most part, Ammophila arenaria is in the south, Ammophila breviligulata in the north, although they do coexist. And so there was basically a landscape level, kind of epic landscape level transformation that occurred by the 1950s. That's recorded in this wonderful book by William Cooper from 1958, which he mapped all the dunes in Oregon and Washington, actually in California as well, and took photos of what the landscape looked like at that time. And so you can see that in a lot of these photos, there's kind of a, either very open sandy environment, kind of a hummocky sandy environment that has, some kinds, you can sort of see beach grasses in the distance, to, what we would think of as kind of fully fledged foredunes in this photo. So this was at a time when the transition was happening, where the beach grasses were starting to invade and actually really kind of shape the landscape. And we have other photos where we can do comparisons. Here's a photo of Pacific City in 1930. You can see lots of white, right? No grasses, actually no houses, no roads. And then in 2012, you can see there's a fording down here, lots of grass, tons and tons of houses. So the whole city of Pacific City built up after these fordings had been established. Here's a picture of Umpqua Dune. So this is down near Coos Bay in 1930. It's an aerial photo. You can kind of see a little smattering of something dark there, that's probably beach grass is starting to take over, and then here it is today. And you can see that highly vegetated habitat, the fore dune is right here along there, but then behind it is all this stabilized swamp and forested land that has been able to establish given the reduction in sand supplied to the back area of the dune. So what are some of the consequences of this transformation? Well, obviously, capturing and stabilizing shifting sand is one consequence. These fore dunes serve as barriers. We can't deny that for extreme storms, sea level rise, maybe even tsunamis. And they also prevent beach erosion, especially compared to hard structures such as riprap. And so that really promotes beach recreation in our area. So they have a lot of kind of positive benefits that are related to, kind of thinking about them as kind of living shorelines. But there are also some trade-offs. So, they've allowed development in historically hazardous areas that people couldn't have lived on in the past. They've caused the decline of a lot of native species, including the western side plover, which is federally listed. And I'll talk a little bit about it later. There's been an invasion of other species, including Scotch broom and gorse, as a result of the invasion. And some people don't like how it interferes with their coastal viewshed. So if you have a house on the coast and you have a fore dune in front of it that obscures your view, that can be problematic for people. Also, I think there's sort of this nature-based aesthetic where, some people who don't know that it's not native think it looks great, but the people who know that it's not native think it looks awful. So, there's sort of these judgment calls about the fact that it's an invasive species. Okay, so that's the past. What about the present? So what are we working on? What are we attempting to understand about these systems? So dune ecosystem ecology could involve a lot of different processes, studying a lot of different kind of aspects to dune ecology. Some of the aspects that we've studied are how does it spread? How does it why does it spread so well? Why does it, sort of the ecophysiology of the plant? We've also studied the species interactions between the two different species. But what I'm going to talk about today is really focusing on kind of these biophysical effects. So how does the plant actually capture sand and build dunes? And this is a cartoon from a paper that we just had published. It's a review of dune building called Ecomorphodynamics, and it's in Nature Reviews. So we've asked this question, how are dunes built? And so what we've done is kind of use a multi-scale approach using both observations, experiments, and also models of the interaction between plants and sand. So we just want to know how do plants and sand interact to create dunes? And we've looked at that from kind of a regional scale, so looking at the drivers of dune shape at a very large regional scale across Washington and Oregon, to local drivers of dune shape. So looking at using experiments to look at how dunes are formed at the scale of a fore dune, at the scale of a kind of a whole plant, and these other common garden experiments, and even at the scale of a single stem of a plant. And then we can use those data in modeling efforts. So we can look at, given certain conditions, given, data that we've collected, can we predict how dunes will build over time? Can we predict their size and so forth, given a certain amount of sand supply? given a certain density of plants. So we're trying to look at the mechanisms controlling dune formation. So at a regional scale, one of the first things that we discovered is that, so we did these transects, 20 different sites, 233 different transects along the entire Washington and Oregon coast, and used Bayesian network analysis to try to figure out what the best predictor of dune shape is. And what we found is that through all these analyses, about 50% of the shape of a dune is dependent on sand supply. So taller dunes are going to have greater sand supply than shorter dunes. Only about, well, I shouldn't say only, 10% of the variation is explained by the plants themselves, their density. And so the denser they are, the greater the height of the dune, the greater the width of the dune. The other thing that we discovered, and I should say that we did a similar kind of analysis on the Atlantic coast, in the Outer Banks. And in this system, there are actually 4 different grass species, all native. So it's a kind of actually a really interesting system from that perspective. And again, our analysis showed pretty much remarkably kind of similar results in that about 60% of the variation that we found in dune morphology was explained by sand supply, about 10% by grass density. The other thing that we discovered really early on is that across the region, the different grass species are associated with different dune morphologies. So Mophala arenaria, which is the European beach grass, was associated with taller and narrower dunes. Mophala breviligulata is associated with shorter and wider dunes. And so this is just an association. And remember, I was telling you that most of the Mophala breviligulata is in the north, so maybe there's something about sand supply in the north that's different than in the south. So it's just that, a correlation, an interesting observation, but we didn't know really if the beach grasses themselves could play a role in the shape of the dune. Then we also know that the beach grasses and dune grasses in general can vary a lot in their morphology. And so, given this kind of wide variability, does that have an effect on the dune shape, the sand capture of these plants, and then also, ultimately the kind of dune building capabilities of them? And so we embarked on a number of experiments to try to look at the role of kind of species-specific effects on dune shape. And one of those experiments was a wind tunnel experiment that we did over in Hinsdale, the Wave Research Center on campus. And another were common garden experiments. We've actually done 3 of these, all at Hatfield. And so we want to tell you a little bit about kind of the results of those experiments. The wind tunnel experiment, what we wanted to do was put grasses in there, the different species of grasses. So we had 3 different species, the Mophala arenaria, Mophala breviligulata, and the native dune building Landmus mollis. We blew sand across these grasses. We planted them in different densities in these pallets, basically, and then blew sand across the grasses and measured sand deposition in pallets. And so what we found was, not surprisingly, thicker, taller shoots, leaves, and rhizomes. Rhizomes are the underground stem of the plant. All of those, whenever they were thicker, taller, there was more sand deposition. Also, sand deposition increased with greater shoot density. So as we increase shoot density, we're linearly increasing sand deposition around the plants. So that was cool. I mean, it verified that there's something about morphology that's important, there's something about density that's important in terms of sand deposition. The other thing that we did was these common garden experiments where we planted these grasses either in polyculture, so in kind of a competitive interaction situation, excuse me, or in monoculture. And then we deposited different amounts of sand on top of the grasses and looked at their kind of morphological response to that deposition. We also looked at their species interactions, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But basically what we found, we could decompose these bags, so take them apart and then measure a whole bunch of different characteristics of the grasses that were in the bags with the different deposition. And basically what we found is that Ammophila arenaria has thin, very densely spaced shoots. It has immense vertical rhizome growth compared to its congener Ammophila breviligulata, which has kind of thicker stems, less densely spaced, more horizontally growing rhizomes. That's why it's not so densely spaced. And then Lamo, or Lamus mollis, the native, has very thick stems and shoots, very sparsely distributed, and it has massive horizontal growth form compared to, for example, even amber or amar. And so these different growth forms and different shoot morphologies really came through in the experiments. We could see how the plants were responding to different kinds of sand deposition. And in the wind tunnel experiments, we were able to kind of get an idea of the differences in sand deposition that the plants created. So we were able to kind of pull apart this kind of feedback between the sand deposition and the species' ability to grow and capture that sand. So the final experiment that we've done, which is pretty massive, took a lot of effort, is this plot scale, so 20 meters by 10 meter plots in which we planted different beach grass species in. And this experiment took place at Nehalem Spit. This is actually a restoration site that was bulldozed down, so the dunes were bulldozed down to create plover habitat. And so we used part of this restoration site to do this experiment. It's actually an ongoing experiment, is still going on out there. And then but basically what we did was we planted different species of grasses in monoculture and polyculture and measured a bunch of different parameters. But the one that I'm going to talk about today is dune shape. And so we did these plantings in 2021. Here's what the dunes look like in 2025. And you can see that, yeah, the grasses grew, they captured sand, they built dunes. And these are profiles, so they're elevational profiles using LiDAR, looking at the change in elevation over time. So starting in 21, which is kind of blue, all the way up to the red last March. And so this is Ammophila arenaria's dune. You can see by far has the tallest dune. This is Ammophila breviligulata's dune, much shorter, actually about half the height. This is a dune that was formed by Ammophila arenaria and breviligulata being planted together. Again, the dune is pretty, relatively short, actually kind of comparatively, compares equally with Ammophila breviligulata. And then this is Lamo dune. So this is the native grass. Its dune, you can see, is very lame, very, very tiny, and not very, very kind of hummocky. So this is, you know, our kind of our best proof, I guess you would say, that the grasses form different dunes and different shapes. And that likely the reason why it's not sand supply, differences in sand supply, because the sand supply is equal at the site. But in fact, due to differences in their growth patterns and their ability to capture sand as a result of that. And then the final evidence that we've kind of worked on is actually using a numerical model. So taking the data from the wind tunnel experiment and repurposing it in this model. This model is called Aeolus. It's like a sand transport, sand capturing model. And this is work by my postdoc, Anton Laporte Foray, who converted the morphologies of the different grasses and their growth patterns into a grid. And then ran a model, so ran kind of a sand capture model across this grid. And produced different simulations of dune formation. And so you can see here that this kind of bright green dune right here is Ammophila arenaria. So taller, thinner. This darker green is Ammophila breviligulata, a bit shorter, wider. And then this, the very, very bright green is Lambus mollis, or the native dune grass. So this model kind of confirms, you know, our thoughts about how these, you know, the different kind of surface areas and growth patterns of the plants can manifest themselves into different organs. And so we can actually kind of put this all into, you know, conceptual model and think about, you know, if we kind of order the different grass species from Ammophila arenaria over here to Lambus mollis over here, our native. And in between, we've got some species from the East Coast, including Ammophila breviligulata. You know, we might predict that given the differences in morphology, given the differences in their dispersion across the landscape, that we would have different dune morphologies for a given amount of sand. Okay. So the other whole side of this is not dune building, but dune breaking down, or dune destruction, right? Dune erosion. And so we've worked a lot on dune erosion and flooding risk. And a lot of this work is done by Peter and his group, his students and so forth, using, you know, our surveys and using kind of the data that we have in terms of grasses. And so again, we kind of take this multi-scale approach where we're looking at regional scale dune flooding and erosion. We also conduct experiments. These are in the Wave Lab at Hinsdale. These were experiments that Megan Wengrove did, looking at dune erosion, sending different waves at dunes that were created. And then also using modeling and climate change scenarios. And so, you know, all of this work is ongoing. I'm not going to talk about it much, but, you know, it's the other part of what we're doing is trying to understand, given that we know about how dunes are built, we also want to know how are they destroyed and how are they flooded and what kind of coastal hazards they produce. Okay, so future. So I want to talk about three things. One is biodiversity, one is carbon storage, and one is a new invader. So again, I told you about, we have these native plant native dune communities really that included animals and plants. but we know really very little about the natural history of these native dunes. But we know that they didn't include grasses and they didn't include foragings. So one of the species here, western snowy plover, is highly affected by foragings and grass species in general. It doesn't breed in areas that have more than about 30% vegetation. The dune itself restricts access to their feeding, which is on the beach. And so, and also doesn't allow them to kind of build their nest because they're ground dwelling or ground nesting birds. And so they have declined quite a bit in Oregon and Washington. And in 2007, I think, they were federally listed under ESA, and restoration began on these dune systems to try to recover the plovers. And you can see that they're very cute. This is a baby plover. There's another one. So like they're the cutest bird I think I know of. I mean, baby bird. Other birds are cute. Good thing Jane's not here, right? So there was, you know, there is and there was ongoing restoration for these habitats. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but they go in and bulldoze down the foredune all the way back to the back dune, spread out the sand, and hope that the plovers will come back and breed in these areas. And here's a picture of dunes overlook. You can see the whole foredune has been chopped down. And now actually, you know, so there's a ton of restoration sites along, especially in the southern Oregon. And there's one up in Washington at Ledbetter Point. So all these sites are, you know, active areas of plover breeding, and actually plovers luckily are recovering. So we've studied these systems, you know, along with the invaded systems. And one of the papers that we wrote was looking at what happens when you do dune restoration and how does it manifest itself in terms of, you know, snowy plover recovery, but and native plant richness, but also what happens when you bulldoze a dune down. Does that increase flooding? Does it increase erosion in the area? And so this paper is by Ruben Field, who surveyed a whole bunch of these HRA sites, these habitat restoration areas, and looked at the relationship between beach grass percent cover and the change in, for example, snowy plover productivity. So you can see as beach grass cover goes down, snowy plover productivity goes up. Also, native plant richness doesn't change much. And part of that is because of the bulldozing. So, you know, these systems have to, we have to allow the plants to recover, and there hasn't really been an active restoration program to do that. One of the plants, though, this pink sand verbena, is recovering in these areas, which is kind of good news. But the other thing that Ruben showed was that the risk of flooding and fording erosion actually increased precipitously when you take away the fording. So this is all just to say that there are trade-offs, again, for restoration, and that we need to create these restoration areas in places where people aren't behind the dune. So, you know, the coastal hazard aspect of the restoration isn't an issue. The other thing that we've worked on besides restoration is looking at carbon storage in the dunes. So very, very few, there may be less than a handful of studies that have measured carbon sequestration in dunes. And we're one of them. So we went out and cored dunes. This is work by John Stepanek, where he went out and cored dunes and then measured the carbon that was stored in these cores, and also obviously in the above ground vegetation. This is quite a production to get a core out of a dune. and then also extract that core from the PVC tubing. But we kind of devised the system to do that, which requires a track and requires driving on the beach, which can be fun for some people. So what John was able to show is that dunes store a lot of carbon, and in part because dune volume is huge, right? The volume of a dune is massive. Even if the carbon per given volume isn't very large, the total volume of a dune can be massive, and that can really influence how much carbon is being stored. And so what I'm showing here is the tons of carbon per meter along shore distance. So this is basically a slice of dune. You take a slice of dune, we estimate how much carbon is in that slice of dune, and then total that up and get these results. And so from Grayland Plains, which is up in Washington, all the way down to Umpqua Dunes, down in southern Oregon, you can see how much carbon is being stored in these dunes. The most storage happens at Clatsop Plains. Clatsop Plains also has very, very, very large dunes. And so the amount of carbon that's stored in dunes isn't insignificant. And in fact, if you think about valuing carbon from the perspective of kind of economically valuing the social cost of carbon, the value of these dunes is extremely high. We also found that we have about 2 to 3 times more carbon in our dunes than on the East Coast in those Atlantic dunes. We did similar coring out on the East Coast. And so our dunes are more productive. They have more carbon as a result of that. Okay, and then the final thing I want to talk about is kind of a really interesting discovery that we made actually in 2012. So it was a little bit after I gave my promotion talk last time. And this discovery was made by looking at a lot of beach grasses over time and trying to ID them. And we can tell the difference between the beach grasses, but it's you have to kind of know what you're looking for. And one of the things that you have to look for is a thing called the ligule. And the ligule is this little tissue right here, a kind of armpit tissue of the plant between the leaf and the stem. And the ligule will tell you whether or not you have Haemophila arenaria or Haemophila breviligulata. Haemophila arenaria has very large ligules. Haemophila breviligulata actually has very shallow. That mean? Wants me to stop. Oh, there you go. All right. And so we kept seeing this grass that had kind of intermediate ligules. They weren't, as short as breviligulata, but they weren't as tall as a Haemophila arenaria. And so we were thinking, hey, maybe, I wonder if this is a hybrid something. We kept finding, kind of these random, what we thought were hybrids. And so then we decided to investigate further. We collected a whole bunch of this plant and made all these measurements. And it turns out, that this plant is taller than the other 2 species. It has kind of intermediate characteristics to the other 2 species, not just the ligule, but other things. And let's do some genetic analysis. So that's when we kind of paired up with Felipe, and Rebecca Mostow was my grad student at the time. She did this work, and she basically was able to show genetically that this is a new species. It's a hybrid between the 2 Haemophilas. So they've bred with each other, created this hybrid that has chromosomes from each of the parent species. So that was really exciting to find out. And we also just kept, we went out and looked for the hybrid, and so we searched and searched and searched for the hybrid. And, initially we only found like 5 individuals, but over, like a 5-year period, and actually now, so Ian's doing this work, we have probably more than 500 individuals of hybrid. So it's everywhere that where the 2 species kind of co-occur. So in this region up in Washington, down in Fort Stevens, and then there's actually some hybrid at Pacific City as well. And all these places have both Ammophila species, and we think that each one of these individuals is a new hybridization event. So they're not just sexual clones of each other. The other thing we did was create an iNaturalist page, and we actually kind of created this community science project with Coast Watch to get people out there looking for the hybrid. And we've had a lot of success with that, people going out and finding the hybrid and posting it on iNaturalist. So we're collecting more and more data as we go. So we were really interested in the hybrid, whether or not, so we subjected it really to a common garden experiment, because that's kind of our favorite go-to experiment, to look at interactions and look at how these species kind of differ. And so we set this experiment up actually during the pandemic. And this is Rebecca Mostow doing this work, and then grew the plants for a year and a half, and then harvested them and looked at their morphology, and also looked at their species interactions. And so one of the things that we found, so this is a common garden, so we're placing the same amount of plants in each of the bags. They're getting the same treatment, growing either in monoculture or together. In monoculture, what we found was that the hybrid has the fastest growth rate of the 2 parent species, so faster than the 2 parent species. In fact, double the parent species. So these are stem densities in the bags. So it grows really, really well. And one of the things that we think may be happening is that the 2 parents have kind of growth spurts at different times of year. And we think the hybrid actually has growth spurts all times of year. So it's kind of inherited the ability to tiller or put on more stems all times of year. And the other thing that we did was we took apart these bags, measured a whole bunch of morphological measurements, and we can see that this is Ammophila arenaria, this is Ammophila breviligulata growth pattern, and the hybrid has a hybrid growth pattern where it grows both vertically and horizontally really well. And so it's growing, it's basically growing, kind of filling up space very quickly through horizontal growth, but also able to respond to the sand deposition by growing vertically as well. And the polyculture bags where we planted the 3 species together, actually we planted 2 species together, but multiple combinations of those 2 species, showed that in fact the hybrid can't really outcompete, so it kind of coexists with Ammophila arenaria, but is definitely dominant over Ammophila breviligulata. And that's the species, right, that is very abundant in the places where the hybrid occurs as well. So it seems to grow well, it seems to be able to compete with its parents. And, we would predict over time that it might actually become the dominant beach grass out there. The other kind of lucky thing that we did was when we set up this dune building experiment out at Nehalem, we had a hybrid plot. So we planted one of the plots with the hybrid. And here are those profiles. So here's the Mottled area, here's Breville gelata, here's the native, and then this is the hybrid. And you can see that the hybrid builds a taller dune than Breville gelata, but not a Mottled area. Mottled area still is the best dune builder up there. So, we hypothesize that the hybrid will spread widely. We already know that it's very abundant out there, that it can grow, faster than its parents, that it'll spread over time. It could actually create taller dunes in places in the north where it co-occurs with Mottled Breville gelata, but also might create shorter dunes in places where Mottled arenaria is the dominant. So the result, of kind of its spread over time might be kind of mixed. Definitely changing, but it definitely would change the kind of dune landscape that we see. Okay, next steps. We want to find more hybrid beach grass, study its population genetics, its ecology, and that's what Ian is doing. So go Ian. We need to know more about its population genetics. And I should say with Felipe. Yeah. And then the other thing we are doing is studying the community ecology of native dune species. So we haven't really delved into that area of dune ecosystem ecology. But we know there are native plants out there. We want to understand how do they coexist with this invasive species, and are there ways that we can kind of better restore some of the native area, the restoration areas that are out there. And then we want to continue to integrate ecology, geology, climate, human activities. And our next habitat that we're studying are cobble beaches, which are very, actually pretty abundant, but very, very understudied systems. And so Louisa Weiss is doing that work. She's starting to do work on cobble beaches and trying to understand kind of what ecosystem services they provide. And with that, I will take any questions or have any thoughts that you might have. Yeah. Yes, Bruce.
So the hybrids interfertile, can they?
Yes.
reproduce?
So they can reproduce with each other and form F2s. So Rebecca was able to show that in some of the hybrids that she had. They also vary in terms of whether or not one or the other species is the maternal parent. So either one of the species can be a maternal parent. So that's one of the other things that Ian's looking at is, if there's differences in maternal parentage depending on, location and those sort of things. But yeah, the F and then the ratio of F1s to F2s, like how many F1s are out there, how many F2s are out there. Because, once you have an F2, then you've got what they call a hybrid swarm happening, where that hybrids can breed with each other. So now there's just many, many, many more partners and many more hybrids that could be produced. Yeah. Yeah.
So it sounds like this might be coming, but do you have thoughts about how, as the dunes are changing, the plant communities that are interacting with the grass, and near the grass are changing? And sounds like maybe the natural history information isn't too much there, but are you able to go back at all to collections to see how those communities might have changed over time?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it'd be so fun to do that work. I don't, I don't know how they've changed over time. I only know what they are right now and how they've changed over the last 20 years. Which isn't much, but I also haven't analyzed the data to look at that. We have done community surveys for the last 20 years, so we do have data on. But yeah, great question, and always wanted to do kind of like an aerial photo, or, sort of data collection exercise where you could look at kind of how things have changed aerially over time, maybe since the 60s or whatever, but yeah, it's a lot of work, a lot of GIS. Yeah.
Just wondering what the relationship is between these non-native grasses and the amount of carbon stored in the dunes, and if that then complicates decision-making between restoration and ecosystem services.
Yeah, I think it does, because if you're looking at the social cost of carbon, you're removing a lot of carbon from the system. So one of the things that John did was he actually cored these restoration areas. So the areas that didn't have grasses, and he found almost no carbon in the system. So, especially the restoration areas that have been around for a long time, like 20 years, those were completely carbon depleted. So yeah, it's definitely, a thing to consider if you're trying to kind of plan around maximizing ecosystem services or optimizing them. Yeah, Francis.
You said, it seems like the hallmarks of a really good ecosystem engineer, which these are,
Mhm.
is one that there's that very strong physical feedback, like it changes something. But I imagine the other side is that as it changes environment, it has to actually be successful in that new environment as changes.
Right.
Is there any, like, is that quantifiable? Like, do you know, like, aha, regular colada is super plastic, it just does it when it's low or when it's, on top of it.
Yeah, so what ends up happening is, one question is like, could you build a dune so high that actually the plants can't live on it anymore, right? And especially on the face of the dune, and that definitely happens. So, there is a kind of a steepness quotient where it's like all the plants are kind of on the top of the dune, and on the backside, but not on the front of the dune. And the flip side of that is like with Revelgulata, as sand is coming in, it just creates these multiple dune fields, right? So it's just marching out and kind of growing out towards the beach. And building kind of very small hunky and dunes. So in that way, it's kind of adapting to the fact that it can't really build tall dunes, but it can stabilize wide ones. Yeah.
It's such an interesting story that the native species doesn't build before dune, as the introduced species, and then they were brought to do that.
Right.
But what does that mean for coastal communities who are less like this? Native communities and like endangered species, versus like coastal
Yeah, it's just, it makes it really, really hard. Because you want to plant native plants, right? And you can sort of plant really high densities of the native and try to kind of recreate those dunes, but still, even at high densities, like it does not grow vertically, so it just gets buried in sand. So, it's very kind of maladapted to kind of that feedback that Francis was talking about, where, the more sand gets deposited on you, the more you grow, the more, that sort of thing. Yeah. So yeah, it's really hard because people want to plant native plants. The other thing about native plants is that they're really hard to get established. And there isn't material out there. Like, you can't go to a nursery and buy a bunch of native plants and plant them in front of your house or on post, because they don't exist. So, yeah, we're kind of at this phase where, there's a lot of interest in trying to restore these dunes, and there are really good examples, like in Northern California, where they've been very successful in doing this, but, they've, had to pour a lot of money into that kind of project and, have nurseries full of native plants and keep replacing them and, yeah. So, yeah, your average homeowner it's very hard. Yeah,
I was kind of curious, you were talking about the carbon content in the sand. But presumably the grass also needs nitrogen to grow. Have you looked at the nitrogen and what the origins might be, either from legumes like lupins or clovers? Or does it come from the ocean water that's being transported over?
Great. Yeah, good setup for a project that I didn't talk about, but one of my students, Vanessa Constant, looked at the marine subsidies from the ocean, from the beach to the beach grasses, and kind of the nitrogen cycling that happens in dunes. Definitely nitrogen is coming from the ocean, from the beach, and being delivered to the dune. We measured N15, which is kind of a tracer for marine derived nitrogen. Very, very high in the grasses at the toe and kind of the face of the dune, and then it kind of plummets for the grasses in the back of the dune. So they're getting nitrogen probably in other ways like beach pea and, nitrogen fixers. But yeah, the whole, the nitrogen cycle and the kind of marine subsidy story is really, really cool. And something that I just didn't have time to talk about, but yeah.
Thanks for.
All right, thank you, yeah.